There is now more than $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. And this isn't just some sort of, young person millennial issue. This really touches every facet of American lives, both individuals, their communities, our economy, and our country.
In God's name, why are we punishing millions of people because they chose to get an education? That makes no sense.
Another day older, deeper in debt is how I feel. It feels like this huge thing I'll never get out from under.
One of the things that scares me is becoming a parent. I just don't see how that's possible with having a student loan debt hanging over my head.
The idea of student loan cancellation is not something I ever thought would be on the national policy agenda. This is hugely mistargeted to the people who probably need the help the least.
I do not think student debt forgiveness is a good policy. If we were to cancel student loans, we are basically making a decision to provide relief now and have some future generation pay for it later.
This would be a moment for the federal government to say, we had a great idea. It started out with the best of intentions and it went off the rails. It is time for us not only to ask for forgiveness, but to extend forgiveness.
I'm from Mississippi. I grew up in a small town. The population, I think around that time was maybe 1,600. Growing up, I felt like nothing could stop me, nothing could stop us. My father served in the United States Army in the National Guard. He actually went to Iraq. My dad, because he was in the Army, had two jobs. He worked in the factory and was in the National Guard. My mom worked in the factory for 20 years. That factory closed, and so then she pursued nursing. Typical middle-class family. Whatever I wanted, I pretty much got, so I felt like my parents were rich. It wasn't until I went to college that I realized that that was not the case. I became exposed to what I guess being middle class really meant. My parents made, too much money for assistance, but they didn't make enough money for them to be able to just write a check and pay for school. And so loans were really my only option. I went to Delta State, majored in accounting, did very well, but then the financial woes really hit me. Every semester I would, find myself in a situation where the semester would start, I would need to buy books. I didn't have the money. The first semester I tried using my credit card. That worked out okay, but then those credit cards, those bills had to be paid. And so then I got caught up in credit card debt. And so I realized that, I can't keep doing this. This is a cycle that I don't want to be in. And so I decided that, maybe going to college right now is not the best choice for me. Maybe I need to work, save some money, and then go and get my degree. I feel that the student loan debt, my student loan debt, personally, is very crippling. All in all, for every attempt of getting my degree, my current balance is north of $30,000. Then when you graduate and you look at the balance, or in my case, you don't graduate, but yet you still have these student loans that you're responsible for. I know that I've made a few payments. A lot of times I've had to defer just because it's either make these payments or pay my rent. And of course, you have to have a roof over your head. One of the things that scares me is becoming a parent. I just got married last year, and my wife is on me like, hey, I'm ready, are you ready? And so, I would love to be a parent, but then I look at the cost of childcare and I look at my student loan balance, and it's like, then I'm still going to be balancing. Do I make my student loan payment or do I pay childcare? And I don't want to default on my student loans, but at the same time, if I'm going to become a parent, I want to make sure that my child has the best life possible. And I just don't see how that's possible with having a student loan debt hanging over my head.
Student loan debt is crushing more and more Americans, some wondering, is a college degree worth the price?
One expert says college debt is a ticking time bomb that could have devastating effects.
The higher costs of higher education is creating a stranglehold on mobility for some, and many say it's only getting worse.
We often hear about, the student loan crisis just in terms of these enormous balances, but you really have to think about the impact this is having on individuals and our country. And when you dig deep, it's truly petrifying. Every 26 seconds of every single day, a student loan borrower defaulted. And that's even before the pandemic ever hit. This impacts their ability to get a mortgage, access credit, maybe even to get a job. And that just scratches the surface of the impact that this debt is having. There is now more than $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. There's more student loan debt than there's all car loans. There's more student debt than there's all credit card debt in America. So for the last decade, I've been traveling the country, talking to people of all walks of life about student loans. And one of the things that has really stuck with me is how the student debt crisis is really a quiet crisis. Maybe unlike the mortgage crisis where, you could see down the street there, used to be a house owned by your neighbor that's now owned by the bank. There isn't this visual, tangible thing you could see when your neighbor defaults on a loan or your neighbor struggling to, save for retirement because their student loan bill just never seems to go away. And I think that has also hampered our ability as a country to actually tackle both the root causes of this crisis and the fallout it's had on American families. To truly tackle this problem, we have to think about it holistically. It's making sure that the next generation doesn't face the burdens that this generation has. It's helping borrowers with student debt now against the predatory industry that has targeted them for far too long. And yes, it includes eliminating and reducing some of the burden that student loan borrowers currently have.
The push to convince President Biden to wipe out student loan debt for tens of millions of Americans is gaining momentum.
We cancel $50,000 worth of student loan debt, and what that will mean is that 85% of those who are struggling with student loan debt right now, about 40 million people, will see their student loan debt completely wiped out.
With the stroke of a pen, President Biden can provide relief to tens of millions of families across the country, close the racial wealth gap, and set our nation on a path to a long-term, just, equitable recovery.
I do not think student debt forgiveness is a good policy. This could be a very serious moral hazard problem. And when I say moral hazard, what I mean is for people who are thinking about taking out loans and thinking about how much in loans they should take out, they're going to be looking at the fact that a bunch of people just got their loans canceled. It seems deeply unfair that someone who borrowed loans yesterday gets cancellation and someone who borrows tomorrow doesn't. And I think people who borrow tomorrow will make a very compelling argument that they should also have their loans forgiven. If we were to cancel student loans, we are basically making a decision to provide relief now and have some future generation pay for it later. That's particularly egregious since we're also saying we're not going to change any parameters of the student loan system. So we'll have just as much debt in the future and people will be paying taxes to pay for these previous policies. When we're thinking about policies, when we're thinking about trade-offs, what's the best way to use the next dollar, to use the next taxpayer dollar? We want to have the maximum effect. And I think that we should be considering policies that can help people at the lower end of the income spectrum, especially now. Those tend to be the people who didn't go to college, who didn't take out any debt.
I think the first thing I always like to point out when talking about student loan cancellation is that it's a solution that ignores the solution that's already in place. The student loan safety nets that are already existing, called income-based repayment and public service loan forgiveness, those programs alleviate unaffordable monthly payments to people who have a low income. Maybe they have a low income because they didn't finish school, or they finished school but it didn't serve them for some reason. And so in those cases, the benefits of a lower monthly payment and ultimately having your debt forgiven, those are given just to the people who did not see a big return on their schooling. The problem is we never had a point in time where we stopped and wrote new legislation that said we want all borrowers to be eligible for that sort of benefit. Instead, what happened was through a patchwork of executive actions and bits and pieces of legislation here and there, we ended up with a cobbled together universal safety net for student borrowers. So while every borrower in the country does have access to income-based repayment and this potential for forgiveness in the future, that's through a variety of different programs. The programs have different parameters, and not surprisingly, it's really challenging for people to navigate these programs. Education on average is still a very good investment. So even though people are borrowing a lot to go to college, to go to graduate school, for the most part, in the long run, those people are better off financially, even with that debt, than they would have been had they not gone to college and just been stuck earning the wages that are generally available to people without higher degrees. So when you think about how well does a widespread cancellation or Jubilee event serve the country, the challenge is that it gives a lot of benefits to people who are already doing quite well in this economy.
I was listening to the radio and hearing a lot of talk about student loan cancellation. The reasons against I was hearing was that it would mostly benefit higher income earners, people with advanced degrees who then earn more money because of their advanced degrees, which, I mean, I'm not an economist, but in some ways that makes sense. But the first thing that came to my mind is like, well, that's not true for teachers. Good morning, Lorena. Thank you for being early. We're gonna be in a Pear Deck today. We've experienced wage stagnation, in the last few decades. Adjusted for inflation, in some places our wages have gone down. It felt like we were all being lumped together with doctors and lawyers. And I can't speak for them. I don't know, maybe they have a hard time paying too, but I just know my experience was just that I don't feel that my advanced degree put me in a better position to pay my loans back. I feel like my advanced degree dug me deeper into debt. Monday's period 1. It's gonna start in 10 minutes. You guys have enough time to take a stretch break and get a glass of water. I started school in 2014, so I took out $50,000 of student loans and I finished my master's program in 2016. I'm doing the income-driven repayments, which is like really the only way I can afford to make them. And I've paid off $9,000 of the loan, but only of the interest. I've only paid $97 of principal. So if I was doing the standard repayment, I think it would be about $600 a month, but that's not an option for me financially. So I do the income driven, which it depends on the year. It's either like $220 to, I think I've paid as much as $280. But because I'm paying less, the interest accrues more. So it just feels like quicksand. It feels like this huge thing I'll never get out from under. That's the one that kills me because it's been, a couple months shy of 5 years of making payments. It was, for me at that time, the scariest thing I'd ever done in my life was to take out $50,000 worth of student loans. The only reason I was able to justify it to myself was, one, I would always have a job. It's a very secure profession. And two, I was like, well, there's teacher loan forgiveness. Right now states have patchwork of loan forgiveness. The federal program is laughably inadequate. For most subject areas, if you teach 5 years at a high needs school, you get $5,000 forgiven. If you teach in a subject area that they need teachers, if you teach math, science, or special ed, that's $17,500. But still, like $5,000 is a tenth of the original loan balance I had. So teacher loan forgiveness as it stands is it's almost like, it feels like an insult. And also, if you accept that loan forgiveness for those 5 years, it does not count towards your 10 years of public service loan forgiveness.
So one of the things that we understand now better than we used to is that when people are making financial decisions, there are lots of ways that those financial decisions get manipulated. And so when you see debts rising really quickly, and when you see people suddenly being more and more willing to take on some risky debts, you have to ask yourself the question, why? And so it's not that people are sort of ignorant or they sort of lack a sense of self-control. This is not a payday lender. And this is your federal government. And this is a federal government that's told you that this is not only good for you, but good for the nation. I think part of it is that we sometimes forget the origins of these debts. It was called the National Defense Education Act in 1958 when we were responding to Sputnik and saying, this is a national priority. And then in the civil rights movement, we then said this is a priority for equity and inclusion and racial justice. And so when people are responding to their federal government, because we trust, at least we hope to trust our federal government, and they're responding to something that's supposed to make their lives better, then they're more willing to take on those debts.
If you go back to 1975, it was really different. In the 1970s, roughly 12% of students used student loans, and their amount of borrowing was lower. And in the 70s, what we also did was we had a system where we used Pell Grants, which are a grant aid to students, to support not just low-income students, but also middle-income students, so that almost anybody could go to college debt-free. But then in the 1980s, the Reagan administration and Congress stopped paying adequately for Pell Grants. And we went a decade where students had trouble finding money to go to college. And so at the end of the 1980s, a set of financiers and bankers said, we've got a solution. Instead of using grants to pay for college for most folks, we could use loans. But if we're gonna make the loans, in order for us bankers to make those loans, we actually need the federal government to give us a subsidy for that, so that we'll be guaranteed to make money on those loans, even if students find themselves unable to repay. And these big changes that they were pushing got adopted by Congress in 1992 and signed into law and implemented by the first Bush administration and the Clinton administration. And so between 1992 and 1994, Congress and the federal government radically increased eligibility for student loans, and they doubled the amount that students could borrow while in college. And so we went from having about $20 billion in student loan borrowing every year in the 1980s to having $120 billion in borrowing per year at its peak. But there's a twist, and the twist comes in 2010 when the Obama administration says, hey, wait a minute, why are we paying this subsidy to banks to make these loans? We could just make the loans ourselves as the federal government.
By cutting out the middleman, we'll save American taxpayers $68 billion in the coming years.
We could use the savings to make interest rates on loans lower for students. And we could even use some of the savings to provide more grants, like the Pell Grant for higher education. And so in 2010, as part of legislation passed by Congress and the federal government stopped giving that subsidy to banks, and the Department of Education started making the loans itself, which in some ways is better. But at the same time, this put us on a course where the US Department of Education effectively became the largest commercial bank in America in 2017, with almost $1 trillion in outstanding student loans in its portfolio. And we haven't seen student debt go away as a problem since then. It's only gotten worse. I think it's fair to ask the question, do we really want the Secretary of Education to be effectively the CEO of the largest consumer bank in America?
Unfortunately, what we have seen time and time again is a range of mismanagement, incompetence, and even, nefariousness when it comes to how the department actually manages the debt on behalf of tens of millions of people. And we've seen how student loan companies, for-profit schools, student loan debt collectors will get every leg up, will cut every corner, often with no accountability, no standards, and no repercussions when they rip off borrowers. We also see how the student loan industry targets particularly communities of color and borrowers of color. We've seen cases about how for-profit schools engage in, redlining practices, particularly offering worthless degrees into the hardest hit communities. We see how student loan servicers will fail to get borrowers of color into critical consumer protections, leaving them more prone to delinquency and default. And this happens over and over again, where it's not only more debt, it's how the student loan industry drives needless interest, fees, predatory products that just makes the student debt crisis even worse.
The other thing to keep in mind here is that there were a lot of colleges that were seeing their expenses going up. And the one thing that they could count on was the fact that the demand for education was not going to go away. So long as the federal government's backing those loans and you've got this really robust market to provide those loans, whatever your expenses are or what they are, the students will still come. And that is exactly what happened. I mean, they have come into sort of situations where there are some beautiful dorm rooms now across all these colleges, great athletic facilities, et cetera, but at a very high cost. But the other sort of thing that we sometimes forget is while the cost of college has skyrocketed, the incomes that people are earning has not. And also realize that if you happen to be Black or Latinx, you're likely to start your career at a lower starting salary, even in the same occupation.
These disparities didn't just magically occur. They are the consequences of generations of systemic racism, discrimination, and what I call policy violence that has systemically denied Black and Latinx families the opportunity to build wealth, forcing our families to take on greater rates of student debt for the chance at the same degree as our white counterparts.
Having grown up in South Carolina, the one thing that I would hear over and over again as a young Black kid was, get your education. It's the one thing they can't take from you. And so you were supposed to do whatever it took, and the family was willing to do whatever it would take in order for you to, get your education, which required debt. So they both got the same education. And if we think about this in terms of like how much it costs to purchase a car, one of them got that education and only had to buy one car. The other one got that education and had to buy two cars and is discovering that the education isn't doing quite as much for them on the job market, though it does something for you on the job market, but not as much as it does for your white counterpart. And so you see this gap opening up.
So after leaving Delta State, I decided to move to Virginia to pursue Year Up. Immediately, I felt a sense of relief because being accepted into the program reminded me that I still had what it took to be successful. I still had what it took to achieve the goals that I had set for myself. And that sometimes it's okay to look at different alternatives to achieve those goals, and that college is not the only solution. I've been with the same company for 8 years. I started off as an intern. They promoted me or hired me as a junior engineer. And then I was promoted to a senior engineer. And now my role has changed completely and I'm a Scrum Master. I feel that I don't need a degree in order to, one, continue to work or to even be promoted at this point.
For me, if I do the math, 10 years, I will have paid $30,000 in loans. So that's money that isn't going to my retirement. It's not going to a mortgage. I'm not accruing any, equity or interest on that. It's just money that's gone. But with my students, I really stress having a plan. I think we have moved away from this kind of Pollyanna, just take out the loans, it'll be fine. I think we really help them at our school, pursue the scholarship opportunities, pursue these different routes. And we really are very frank with them. While it's not the right route for every single student, I think for the vast majority of students, I do still recommend it. And that's it. That's all the time we have. Goodbye, you guys. Bye. Happy birthday again, Maria. Goodbye, Miriam. Goodbye, Emmanuel.
I think we're at a place in American culture where we have been made to believe that having a college degree, a bachelor's degree or above, is somehow part of the American dream. and that without it, we're a failure. You know, we are celebrating education so much in this country, which is wonderful because we want people to get education so that they can provide more for themselves, provide more for their country, and that's great. But not everyone needs a degree. We know that students are signing on the dotted line without knowing what they're signing up for. And we see more and more that parents, even middle-class parents, are signing and saying, okay, I'll just cover the rest with my own personal debt. And it's debt that they can't afford.
There's no silver bullet for a $1.7 trillion crisis. And we really need to tackle this from all angles. You know, we need to enhance the consumer protections so student loan borrowers are no longer, second-class citizens being forced to deal with abuses that people with a mortgage or a credit card don't have to face. We need to improve the Department of Education to ensure that they're actually doing a much better job overseeing these programs. We have to make a college more affordable for the next generation, so we're not just dealing with this, in another 5 years. And on the table needs to be reducing, canceling the debt for millions of people across this country who have been held back because of it.
There's a cost to forgiveness. It depends on the cancellation policy being proposed, but it's either hundreds of billions of dollars or up to $1 trillion. That cost adds to the federal debt. So ultimately, taxpayers are responsible for the federal debt. The other thing I think we have to think about is there is an upper limit to the amount the federal government can borrow. We obviously haven't reached it yet, but there's an upper limit. And so if we cancel $1 trillion in student loan debt, when the next crisis comes, will we have as much ability to deal with that crisis as we would have otherwise?
Part of this is just recognizing the humanity of debtors, recognizing that they had ambitions when they took out those debts to go to college, and asking ourselves what would happen if they got a fresh start. We give fresh starts to people who make lots of money. When the banks start to fail, they get a fresh start. If we want to right the wrongs of the student loan problem, one of the ways to right that wrong is to say, sorry, we messed up. This would be a moment for the federal government, President Biden, to say, we had a great idea. It started out well and with the best of intention, and it went off the rails. So because we messed up, it is time for us not only to ask for forgiveness, but to extend forgiveness.